Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Democracy and Development, confronting a central ethical dilemma of international development with lessons from Rwanda and the Gambia. In this video, we are going to be looking at donkeys and democracy. We're going to be both providing a story to start us off around the importance of democracy throughout development, as well as giving some of the philosophical and more analytic arguments that support the claim that democracy is important for development. So I begin with a story from a friend of mine named MMS Ba about a village in the Gambia. The Gambia is a very thin country straddling the Gambia River. There's a single paved road on either side of the river running along it, but not a single bridge. More on that in a future video. There's one major city at the mouth of the river, but though to call it a city is probably an exaggeration. Not long after you leave the city, you'll drive through a small rural village. You'll drive through many, in fact, but this one is special. This village has many chickens, cows, sheep, and goats. But more than anything, this village has a lot of donkeys. Not long ago, these donkeys helped pull carts for the villagers to fetch their water from the next village over, because even though they had many animals, the village did not have a clean water source. One day, foreigners from an NGO came to the alcalde, or the chief, of the town and told him, "We're going to build an open-air market here. Our research has shown that markets are the best way to improve the economic livelihoods of people in developing countries. The best way that we can spend the money that all of these donors have given us is by building a market. And that's going to give so much prosperity to everyone in the community. It's going to change people's lives, and it's the most ethical way for us to spend this money because it's going to have the most impact per dollar." The alcalde told them that the village did not need a market, that they needed a borehole for a pump to get clean water. The NGO responded, "We only make markets. Building a pump would not be the most effective use of our donors' money, and therefore it wouldn't be ethical for us to build you a pump because we could be building more markets somewhere else, and those markets are going to be more effective, according to our research. But if you don't want the market, we can just go to the next village over. In this area of the Gambia, there's many, many small villages along the road, just 1 or 2 kilometers away from each other, and build one there." The people of the village got mad at the alcalde when they heard that he had told the NGO to go to the next village. Maybe the NGO was right, and the market would help them out, they argued. Maybe they could convince the NGO to give them some money through the process. The alcalde went back to the NGO and said that they could build the market in that village. The NGO spent a lot of money to build a big, beautiful market right on the road. When the market was opened, the village threw a huge party to thank the NGO. The NGOs took some pictures of the good that they had done to satisfy their donors and left, off to build another market in another town. The next day, no one used the market, and they went back to their daily routine of traveling all the way to the next village to fetch water. Day after day, the market stood empty, until, on one very hot day, one of the donkeys wandered into the market. Having found a nice, cool place out of the sun, she called to her friends, "Look at this nice, cool stall I've found." Soon the rest of the donkeys in the village had joined her there, and so had the chickens and the cows and the goats, and to this day, the village still does not have a borehole and still does not have clean water. But whenever you drive up country in the Gambia, as you drive out of the city, you can see, standing as a testament to the importance of participation in development, the nicest donkey stall in the entire country. The moral of MMS Ba's story is that development is not effective without participation from the community. In this video, we'll look at what it means for a community to participate in their own development. When we say that the NGO failed to allow for participation or democracy, what exactly should they have done differently? And would that have actually made it more effective? To answer these questions, we'll start with the works of Denis Goulet and build on that with reference to the works of David Crocker. In his paper, Participation and Development, New Avenues, Goulet outlines 4 different dimensions of participation. The first is the purpose of participation. Is it a means or an end in itself? The distinction is central to the present dilemma, so we're going to take a second to look at it. If it's a means, then participation is simply the most effective way to get something done. If it is an end in itself, then whether or not it's the most effective way to get something done, participation is important, even if it's less effective at getting something done. Participation is a good. It's something we value. Democracy is something we value. The instrumentalist, on one hand, claims that participation in development is just the most effective way to do development. And if you could do it more effectively without participation, you should. On the other hand, the teleologist claims that participation is a good in itself. Regardless of the outcomes, the people affected should have a voice in their own development. So, once again, the instrumentalist says that participation is the most efficient way to accomplish some other goal of development, be that better health outcomes, higher GDP, etc. If people are not involved, the process will fail. MMS Baugh's story about the donkeys can be viewed as making this case, saying that the reason that the project was unsuccessful was that the community wasn't involved in the choosing of the process, of the choosing of the problem, or the choosing of the way to solve that problem. Because they weren't involved, the NGO took a top-down approach that was ineffective because they didn't allow for participation. Regardless of the moral question of whether it would be good or not to let a community choose what happens to it. The teleologist, on the other hand, says that participation in development is a good in itself, and regardless of the outcomes, it should be pursued. Even if the project fails in accomplishing its other goals, it can still accomplish the goal of being participatory and is therefore a success. The story of the donkeys offers very much an instrumentalist case for participation, but one could just as easily offer an argument based on the principles of justice for the teleologist position, saying that democracy is something that is good, it's something that we value, it's something people have a right to, and so when developing a community, we should give people choice. Goulet's solution to this dilemma is to propose that participation is both a good as a means and good in itself. This hybrid purpose is sufficient so long as participatory methods actually lead to the best outcome, or, if not the most efficient outcome, at least a morally permissible one. The dilemma that we're looking at arises when the instrumentalist goal of using participation as a means to some other end conflicts with the teleological goal of participation for its own sake, when in fact the most efficient way of doing something stops being participation, but you still value participation as a good in itself. You end up with a conflict of wanting to accomplish some other goal, increased GDP, increased health, and wanting to accomplish the goal of giving people democracy, or choice. Goulet goes on to define three more dimensions of participation: scope, originating agent, and entry moment. That first dimension is going to be the most important for what we're talking about here, but these other ones are helpful to understand. The scope relates to how far a particular intervention is able to reach. This is the difference between the World Bank imposing conditional funding on a government. Government must impose certain policies to continue to get this funding or to continue to get these rates on a particular loan. An NGO choosing to only enact certain projects instead of others, even if a community wants those other projects, as we saw with the donkey example, and an individual development worker choosing to listen to their community or not. In this series, I offer a theory of development which will apply across all of the scopes, albeit in different ways. And when we get to the actual offering of the theory, the Wahale method of development, we'll explain how it works on each of those different scopes. So scope, you can have a wide scope, which is like a multilateral or a bilateral development assistance. A mid-range scope, non-governmental organizations, projects, initiatives, but also local government initiatives at certain levels, and a very narrow scope, which might be individual development workers and their projects. Goulet divides originating agent of the change into three more different categories: top-down, which are started by elites or experts within the country; bottom-up, created by non-experts or people out of power within the country; and external, originated by outsiders, not from the community. While versions of this dilemma can be found in cases involving all different kinds of originating agent, I'm going to focus on the particular dilemma for the external agent in this paper and in this video. Under this dimension, Goulet makes a distinction between mobilization and organization. For Goulet, mobilization means working to accomplish a particular goal, while organization is the building of a community to accomplish goals, even in the absence of those goals. So mobilization is saying we need to build this schoolhouse. Organization is saying let's get a committee together so that in the future, if there are schoolhouses to build, we can build them together. So once again, we can have wide, middle, and narrow scope, but now we have another dimension. We have top-down, bottom-up, and external. So a wide top-down project might be a project created by a national government because it affects the whole nation, but it's coming from elites within the country. A middle-level top-down project might be a project created by a local, state, or district government. And a narrow top-down project might be a project created by an individual with experience or power just within that specific community, but an elite within the community coming from that country or that place. A wide bottom-up project might be a country-wide grassroots movement for change. It's affecting the whole country, but it's coming from people out of power. A mid-level bottom-up project might be a local NGO, so an NGO started by individuals from the community, from out-of-power groups, created by those individuals to accomplish project or make change. And a narrow bottom-up process might be an individual working in a community, doing community organizing to enact development, but that individual not coming from a place of power, not coming from somewhere with power originally. And external, as we said, we're not going to focus on the bottom-up or the top-down as much, if only for comparison. The external are things like, once again, we said multilateral and bilateral development assistance, international NGOs at the middle scale, and similar organizations, and on the narrow scale, individual development workers from abroad. Now, Goulet's fourth dimension of participation is the moment at which it is introduced. He outlines a list of 7 stages of a project. The earlier in the process the community is introduced, the more participatory it is. The problem of the donkeys might never have arisen had the community been brought in at an earlier stage of the process. So the 7 steps Goulet outlines are: diagnose the problem, figure out what is the problem you're going to solve. List the possible solutions, choose a solution, prepare to implement a solution, implement that solution, evaluate the process, and consider further action. Now, when the NGO came to the community, they had already done at least 1 through 3, if not 1 through 4. They may have involved the community in the implementation process or the evaluation process, but they probably didn't. They mostly asked their donors in this case, well, did you like the pictures we sent you? Okay, we're going to go build another one. Because the community had so little say in the process and was introduced so late, this was not a very participatory process. Even if the community was engaged in the process of implementation, since they did not get a say in the decisions of either the problem or the solution, they did not use the market, and the project failed. This holds even if it might have actually helped address poverty in the village, as the NGO was convinced that it would, because if the people don't use it, there's no way it's going to address the poverty in the village. Goulet argues that any development practice which is focused on the needs of the people requires that those people are involved from the diagnosis, from the first step of the problem. Now, in his article, Participation in Local Development, Crocker adds to the dimensions offered by Goulet and defends his theory of development in the face of several objections. The dimensions that he uses to complement Goulet's theory are inclusiveness, examinations of barriers and drivers of participation, and the thickness of participation. According to Crocker, inclusiveness consists in assuring that the group which is participating is not just a privileged subset of the population, not just the men, not just the older people in the village, not just the people with money. Depending on cultural norms, this may look different depending on the community. It could mean assuring that a gender often excluded from decision-making is included, or that all ethnic groups in a community are sufficiently represented at the decision-making table. The second additional dimension has to do with the degree to which one examines the reasons that some groups are traditionally excluded and how these are addressed. If particular groups are often excluded from decision-making, it does not suffice to bring those individuals to the table, but to understand and study the reasons that they have been traditionally excluded and account for those reasons in the process and the decision-making. One interpretation of this would be to focus on equity, kind of righting past wrongs, not just equality, allowing equal participation, when opening up participation. In fact, doing more work to assure that people who've been historically excluded have as much access as those who historically have had the power. These two dimensions, which focus on how exactly we are defining the community, are important to how Crocker defends his position against objections. And as we'll see in a couple of videos when we look at objections, they're going to be a bit problematic. The final dimension, which Crocker calls thickness, is determined by the quality of the participation or the power of the community in the process. Crocker advocates for a process which is as thick as possible, in the same way that Goulet advocated for a process which introduces the community at the earliest stage possible. Though he allows for some petitioning or bargaining may be necessary to bring about a deliberative democracy. So we'll look at the positions now. First off, we have nominal participation. This is the least thick. This is the thinnest kind of participation you can have. Putting one's name on a register but not attending. So there are many projects which document the number of people that are involved in the participatory process by having people write their names down somewhere. So you go around the villages, your NGO, you get all the names on the sheet so you can give them to your superiors and said, look at all the people that came to the meeting. When in fact, most of those people didn't. You just had them write their name down saying that they would show up when they never did. Nominal participation, the thinnest level of participation, because they have absolutely no say in the process. They don't even know what's going on. Passive participation. This is one small step up. Attending a meeting, but only listening. We had many people attend this meeting. The whole village came to the meeting and listened to us talk about what we were going to do to them. That's not very thick. Even if we talked to them about the diagnosis of the problem, and we started at that point, if they weren't actually participating in that conversation, it's not really a deliberative democracy. Consultative participation, this is moving another step up, giving input when requested, but not making decisions. So this is the going from a passive group of people in the community meeting and to saying, oh, I'm going to pick out this person. What do you think? What do you think about this situation? And letting them offer opinions, but only when consulted and only as a consultant, not as someone that's actually involved in the decision-making process. Once again, this harkens back to the original example we had of the development worker in a village who is faced with the ethical problem of saying that the community seems to have made a decision, but if you still have a say over whether or not that goes through or not, they don't have the ability to really make that decision. Petitionatory participation, making requests but no decisions. So this goes a step up of saying you're not just giving responses when requested, you're giving your responses or your opinions freely, but you're still not making decisions in the process. The next step up is participatory implementation, deciding how something is done on a small scale. So maybe this is enlisting the people in the village to build the market and letting them design it and go through that process and actually put the stones into place. But it's not giving them a choice of what is done, just how it's done. Bargaining, and as we said with Crocker, he'll give that sometimes you need to be at a stage of bargaining or at the next step as well to have a very thick democracy, but he's going to prefer the next step more. Bargaining is a confrontation between the goals of the community and the elites or the external actors, where all can make decisions, but goals are stagnant and confrontational. So this is the first point where we get to where the community can actually make the big decisions of what are we doing, but they're just facing off with the external actors. If the external actors are saying, we want to build a market, the community is saying, we want to build a well. And they're arguing, the external actors say, well, we'll just go down the road and build something there. Because those goals are static and people aren't really listening to each other or being willing to engage or offer something else, this is still problematic, even though people can make some level of decisions here. And then deliberative democracy, which is the thickest level of participation, and what Crocker is going to advocate for. They all work together to make decisions and determine goals. So we don't come to our goals beforehand based on data that we've gathered. We come to our goals together in a meeting with everyone. This dimension requires the previous two to be effective. So you have to have an inclusive democracy that is looking at the historical barriers for it to work. If only a subset of people is actually deliberating while another group is relegated to nominal or passive participation, that's a problem. For Crocker, the NGO described above did not just bring the community into the process too late, it did not let the community actually make any decisions. They came in with their goals already set. They weren't going to let the community change anything on a large scale. Simply being at the table is not enough. One must actually have power at the table. Crocker claims that if all these dimensions are satisfied, a democracy will generally produce good results. And if it does not, it is because the democracy is not sufficiently participatory. This is a really important point for Crocker. If the process produces a policy which we might consider immoral, that is because we didn't have enough democracy. According to him, if the outcomes of a democratic process are not satisfactory, we should critique the process, not throw out the outcomes as being morally wrong, based on some other metric. In Crocker's view, quote, it does not follow, however, that we need a theory of justice or a philosophical list of capabilities or entitlements to tell us when to choose well-being outcomes over agency-expressing democratic process. In other words, we should not measure the outcomes of the democratic process against a particular theory of justice or morality. For Crocker, basically, in the original case, as long as the democratic process is strong enough, we must follow the conclusions. Crocker claims our commitments to both equal agency and adequate well-being for all should lead us to criticize democratic processes which fail to be sufficiently democratic, and when they fail to deliver on their promise of justice. Basically, he's saying that a process will end up being democratic and just if it involves all of those marginalized communities sufficiently. If you bring in the women that didn't have a voice before, they will speak up and they will assert their rights. If they're not asserting their rights, it's because they didn't have enough of a voice in the process. And so the process should be critiqued, not the end result. Effectively, Crocker is saying that the cause of the problem is the democratic process itself. In the face of the example of the development worker in the first video, he's committed to either claiming that something is wrong with the process used, or that the decision arrived at should be enacted by the community. If you'll remember, in that original thing, we gave a long list of good ways that the process was done. So Crocker is committed either to saying that such a process is impossible, that if it was sufficiently democratic, it would never arrive at an immoral conclusion, or that that conclusion is in fact moral, and he as a development worker should enact it, even if it's something that he might personally think is wrong. What do you think? Are there dimensions of participation which Goulet and Crocker have missed? Do you agree with Crocker that if these 7 dimensions are satisfied, the result of the process must be good? Write your answers in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Stay tuned for Constitutions and Rights, where we'll look at the other horn of the dilemma with Martha Nussbaum, and then some objections to Crocker and Nussbaum, where we'll pick apart both those arguments. The Wahale method of development, isolationist objections and responses, colonialist objections and responses, Boko Haram objections and responses. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.